I am a fourth-year PhD student at the Department of Health Services and Policy. Today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker. But before I introduce the speaker, I just want to set the ground rules. So after I introduce the speaker, we're going to have a Q&A. The presentation from the speaker is going to last for about 40 to 45 minutes. And so the rest of the time we can have a discussion. Feel free to ask your questions then. So Dr. Swarnim Wagle is currently the Chief Economic Advisor at the United Nations Development Program Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific in New York. He leads work on strategy, policy, and partnerships covering 36 countries. Between 2014 and 2018, Dr. Wagle served the National Planning Commission in the Government of Nepal for 3 years, first as the member and then as vice chair. In the aftermath of the Nepal earthquake of 2015, which killed nearly 8,000 lives from what I recall, and the flood of 2017, Dr. Wagle co-led the post-disaster needs assessment and helped garner pledges for billions of dollars in assistance. Dr. Wagle has worked as an international development professional for more than 20 years, including as senior economist at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and UNDP offices in Hanoi, Colombo, and New York. He received his undergraduate education in economics at the London School of Economics, master's from Harvard, and PhD in economics from the Australian National University. He also chairs one of Nepal's oldest think tanks, IIDS, the Institute for Integrated Development Studies. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to the speaker.
Thank you, Vishnu, for that introduction. Vishnu and I go back a long way. We went to the same high school in Nepal, although many years apart. So it is good to reconnect with him recently. Professor Varshney and the Center for Contemporary South Asian Studies, I'm delighted to be hosted by you. It's a lovely institute and a lovely campus. I do remember visiting Brown like 27 years ago. And this time around, it looks nicer and much more prettier and a lot of developments. I was an undergrad student at the time in London, and I had a friend, high school friend, who went to Brown at the time, and one of those summers I came here. So it's wonderful to return to Brown and talk about Nepal. And thank you so much for showing up. I know it's a very busy time for you guys, mid-semester, just before the Thanksgiving holidays. I know these times are quite hectic, and I really am grateful to you for turning up. I've assumed some familiarity with Nepal, but you guys can ask any question on Nepal, any aspect of Nepal. Nothing is off limits in the Q&A session. If anything sounds confusing or needs clarification, just let me know when we go into the discussion phase. The topic for today is really this twin challenge for many low-income countries, right? Especially those that have already embarked on some kind of a democratic experiment. And so this, in the academic literature, there's often this discussion about perceived trade-off between being democratic and being developed, and this is a hugely expanding, contested literature. Professor Varshney and I were talking about this earlier. It's still not settled. But democracy is a good thing, development is a good thing. There shouldn't be a trade-off between these, but nonetheless, there is a lot of discussion around these issues. And I'm going to talk mostly about Nepal, but I think some issues will be relevant to other low-income countries in the rest of South Asia, as well as sub-Saharan Africa. So let me start with, it's probably better for me to stand. So, this just to introduce Nepal kind of unconventionally, in the sense that these 5 points sort of touch on the political, geographic, economic issues, but from something that is relevant to our times. The first point to note about Nepal is really that it's the oldest nation state in South Asia. Not many people know that. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh were actually, did not exist in current shape when Nepal became an independent nation state. Really 1769, when this king of Gorkha sort of unified all these petty mountain fiefdoms and consolidated into this modern, which grew to become modern Nepal. But having said that, we Nepalis take a lot of pride in having been independent for a long time. But really, if you look under the hood, it was more of a semi-colonial adjustment with the Raj, right? The 1816, we actually fought the war with the English. 1857, one of our prime ministers personally led a military campaign to assist the British to suppress the Lucknow mutiny, the Sepoy mutiny, which ended up being very good for Nepal in the sense that we reclaimed, got back a lot of territory that we had lost in 1816, and that sort of a cozy adjustment with the British. The British needed cheap soldiers from the martial race, so-called martial races, to fight their wars in their expanding empires all over the world, and Nepal provided that, and in return, the ruling elite at the time, the Ranas especially, got a lot of money for that, and from that earning, they built a lot of palaces in Kathmandu Valley, which you can still see to this day.
Was it ever fully colonized?
Never, never.
So these were some small princely states that consolidated, and it
became modern Nepal, yes.
1769?
Yes.
And then semi-colonial under the British?
Yeah, since 1816 until 1947, until the British were there, sort of this arrangement that, and the British figured out, they sent a lot of expeditions to see whether trading routes to Tibet could be opened through Nepal. The Nepali rulers then, rightly I would say, protected that interest, but in return, and the British sort of figured out that this is a barren, rugged mountain territory, not really worth their time, and Nepal can be a buffer state, if they can guard themselves, then it's, and that merit, that advantage actually stands to this day, if it was India and China sharing such a long border, it would be quite problematic, as it is in other segments of areas where India and China share a border. Anyway, so this is to say that politically independent, but this practice of soldiers for rent actually still continues to this day. A lot of Nepali soldiers, Nepali citizens, we are embarrassed to talk about it, but still serve in the British and the Indian Army, but the numbers are dwindling, which is inconsistent with the idea of a sovereign state, right? But this is something that has to be acknowledged. Numbers two, it's a very young country. Nepal median age is just 24. So half the country is actually under the age of 24. It's a highly diverse country. For a country of 30 million, we have 126 ethnicities and caste groups, 123 languages. It's a country on the move. A lot of people are coming out of agriculture. That's my third point. But I just want to say that within Nepal, those of you who are familiar with Nepal's 75 or 77 districts, in the last census 10 years ago, 21 districts were shown to be rapidly depopulating, right? So people were just leaving the villages and the districts and migrating to these newly emerging urban centers. But more important than that, a lot of Nepalis are abroad, right? So in a country of 30 million, roughly 5 million are expected to be living abroad. Many are seasonal migrants to India and temporary migrants to the Gulf, Korea, and Malaysia, but a lot of white-collar migration has also happened to the United States. Probably here 300,000, 400,000 Nepalis are believed to be in the US, UK, Canada, Australia, some in Japan, right? So it's a country that has exported a lot of manpower in recent years. And there's a push factor to that, there's a pull factor to that. I'll come to this later. Economically, an important point to note is until 30, 40 years ago, we were an agrarian society, very poor, subsistence agriculture driven, etc. And contribution of agriculture, value added to GDP, was around 50% in 1990 when we opened up to multi-party democracy. That has dropped by half to around 25% in the most recent estimation. And but this is in terms of GDP. In terms of employment, the share is higher, right? Still higher. So even though 25% value added, probably 40, 50% of the people still rely on the agriculture sector for employment, seasonal, part-time jobs, livelihoods. Now the important point to note here is the remittance share of GDP is around 24%, which for a populous country, for a country with a sizable population, and there are some anomalies like Moldova and Samoa and Tajikistan and some small, very peculiar circumstances that countries go through and rely a lot on remittances. But for a normal country, let's say with 30 million people, to have that kind of dependence on remittances as a share of GDP, this is actually the highest in the world, for a sizable country, right? And that has led to a lot of processes within the country. The services sectors are booming, and this is what economists call an atypical structural transformation, right? People are coming out of agriculture, but they're not being absorbed by industry and manufacturing. They've leapt on to the so-called modern services sector, but the services sector is not really modern because your level of development is still really low. So we're engaged in petty trade, smaller, low productivity activities, even in the services sectors. Whereas if you look at the 20th century, sort of a stylized trajectory of how countries develop, out of agriculture, you come to industry. Within industry, manufacturing is a very dynamic, vibrant sector for a generation, 2 or 3 generations, and then you graduate onto a sophisticated services industry. Country like Nepal, straight out of agriculture into services, that job absorbing, job creating, dynamic sort of engine is really missing, right? It's not that we can do what India and China and Vietnam and the other countries are doing. Our peculiar handicap associated with landlockedness will not allow us to go through the same process of industrialization as many of these other developing countries. Nonetheless, some kind of high value to weight ratio industries, niche industries that can be scaled up. There's a lot of potential there, and I'll come to it later. Geographically, I mean, the landlockedness is a very distinctive feature that probably guarded our independence, as I alluded to earlier, but that also imposes a lot of costs in terms of trading costs, engaging with the rest of the world, flow of people, ideas, capital, goods. There's a natural handicap associated with landlockedness globally, and Nepal certainly this is one of the more prominent hypotheses behind Nepal's stagnation, in my opinion. But at the same time, this rough terrain has also given us 8 of the 10 highest mountains in the world, and also the deepest gorge. The Kaligandaki gorge is actually the deepest in the world. Now, looking ahead, our location is actually quite promising. By 2050, according to this work that Danny Kwa does at the National University of Singapore, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, he tracks where the global center of economic gravity is, right? So in 1980s, it was in the middle of the Atlantic, basically reflecting that the 2 motors of the world economy were Europe and North America. Around 2008, 2010, that center had shifted to around Helsinki, Budapest, Eastern Europe, reflecting the rise of China, India, and other Asian economies. 2050, his projection is that it will lie around Nepal, the Himalayas around Nepal, basically reflecting that in the next 30 years, it will be China, India, Southeast Asia, possibly the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Gulf countries will be where the action be economically. And so if Nepal can sort of leverage that, it will be a very important source of growth for the future, right? So this is sort of an introduction to Nepal, where we came from, where we're heading, and what exists. Now, the topic today is, I will be touching on both the development story and the democratic sort of struggles. What is unusual for a country like Nepal is, for a country at such a low level of development, we are the poorest country in Asia, not just South Asia, but in Asia after Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, as we know, is a pretty unique case with long conflicts and all that. But for such a country at low level of development, we've led 3 mass movements for democracy and actually undergone regime changes quite spectacularly, I would say. One is in the 1950s, when we got rid of the Rana regime, 1990, when we got rid of the absolute monarchical regime, and in 2006, when we got rid of the monarchy altogether and went for a republic, right? So these kind of sort of popular movements at such low levels of development, I think, deserve some kind of a sort of a political scientific inquiry, I guess. So it's a very open, vibrant, democratic country. So this is a global sample of countries. This is the polity database that many of you might be familiar with. Number 10 is the most democratic. And this is measured by a number of criteria, but constraints on the executive, media freedom, etc., are all looked into. So Nepal is very democratic, but in level of income, so log of GDP per capita here, were pretty low. And if you see this empty matrix here, which is basically saying that for countries poorer than Nepal, there's nobody else which is more democratic, right? Which is an interesting observation to make, that this poor country has had this democratic aspiration. So it's not a perfect democracy, and I'll talk a lot about the flaws and where the reforms are needed, but this is something to be acknowledged, that this trade-off that we talk about, or you can sustain a democracy only at higher levels of income, etc., is actually challenged by this, even though under this story there are tendencies to revert. A lot of regressions have happened, and when people are disenchanted, frustrated with the lack of development and delivery, we hear of, well, maybe the monarchy should be back, maybe the army should take over the country, etc. Right? Those discussions do happen, but that's often a reaction to under delivery under the democratic regime. And we, those of us who believe in democracy, we sort of say that the answer to flawed democracy is a more refined and perfect democracy. We shouldn't be looking at alternatives of going back to more authoritarian regimes, right? So this is just to show that it's on this dichotomy, democracy development dichotomy, Nepal does stand out. Let's talk a little bit about the history, because that will inform the future direction as well. I was trying to simplify this and say, how would I summarize 250 years of Nepali political economy? So I would say it's a story of extraction, exclusion, and existence, right? So this is 3 E's. So extraction is really the kind of, and if you've read Why Nations Fail by Acemoglu and Robinson, that thesis really comes through, right? The politically extractive and economically extractive institutions really gives you the answer for the long-term prosperity, etc. So for me, geography also looms large in the case of Nepal, but there's a nice interplay between poor institution, extractive institutions, and adverse geography that have really stagnated us. And as I mentioned earlier, the outcome is that we are the poorest country in Asia after Afghanistan. Now, what is striking is, although we were independent in 1769, until just about 1990, there was a brief experimentation with multi-party democracy in 1960, about 17 months. Other than that, this whole period was ruled by absolute monarchy or absolute prime ministers, which is also unusual globally, and hereditary prime ministers. So one can hear about hereditary monarchs, but in Nepal we've had 104 years of hereditary prime ministers. The king was still there, the royal family was still there, but deeply extractive regime. We did our first modern budgeting of the state only in 1952. Until then, everything that the state earned, basically taxes on agriculture, went to the pockets of the Rana rulers. And they were so insecure because their cousins or their nephews would behead them or dislodge them. A lot of that money would go out as capital flight to India. So you see a lot of Rana wealth in actually cities like Calcutta and Dehradun, and even cities of Madhya Pradesh, Delhi, and even in the south, right? So this is a story of extraction. We basically started with slightly more inclusive economic and political institutions only about 1990, but in a very flawed manner, and this is where the challenge is. How do we perfect this, improve this? The second story is of exclusion, right? So the ruling elite, the bureaucracy, the army, and the judiciary has really been dominated by a very narrow group of ethnicities and caste. You can say it's a Khas Arya, Hindu males from the hills, right? Roughly it's the Brahmin, Kshatris, Thakuris, and the Dasnamis, which is this term for sannyasis, and that constitute about 35% of Nepal's population. They've really dominated this. But we should also acknowledge that if we go back to 1769 and what the attitude of the regimes and where they derived their legitimacy from, then it's kind of been a gradual progression. So until the Shahas and the Ranas called the shots until 1950, it really was codified that all citizens are different and supposed to be unequal, right? So the whole Hindu caste system was codified in the 1854 Muliki Ain. So we come from a very uneven, very, very adverse kind of a social and a legally sanctioned sort of exclusionary state. With the panchayat from 1960 to 1990, it was sort of the idea of equality. Again, by the time the modern United Nations was born, we're in the modern era when these things were very much championed. So it said citizens are different, but they are equal. But there was a condition there. In the panchayat regime, it was only if you are assimilated. If you believe in one religion, if you believe in one outfit, if you believe in one language, kind of a undercurrent was there. 1990 onwards, when we restored multi-party democracy again, then I think formally in the constitution we for the first time recognized that Nepal citizens are different, they can be diverse, but they are formally should be equal, right? And then 2006, and there's a lot of ills associated with the Maoist civil war, but one positive externality of that was I think all citizens are substantively equal and should be so, and that should be enshrined in the constitution. That principle was only really enacted in 2006. So if you take this long view from 1769, we're really only experimenting with modernity in terms of social design, in terms of economic dynamism, only about now. It's 20, 30 years, which is my lifetime, you know. So there's no wonder that we're the poorest country. And so if you look at the institutions, if you look at the adverse geography, if you look at how all this was set up as a society, these things are quite important. Just to say that on business though, and this is an interesting flip side, none of the ruling elite are dominant. I was just looking at this data by Hiramani Ghimire, and he sent me some numbers recently. Of the 22 biggest business houses in Nepal, 20 are Newars and Marwadis. So the dominant group, you know, this Khas Arya Hindu males from the hills, feature nowhere on the business front. And there's also an interesting historical sort of origin to that, where in the 1854, only the Newars were sort of allowed to do business and trade, not the others, right? When you are caste codified. And in the Ranas, the Marwadis were invited from Rajasthan to set up modern businesses and forge linkages with the growing Indian economy, right? The third point to note about Nepal is, so existence. We've always been very nervous and kind of paranoid about our two big neighbors, right? And that has played a very prominent role in shaping our psyche, you know. Maybe some of this gets reflected in our knee-jerk nationalism, some of this gets reflected in our inferiority complex, but it's a fact to be reckoned with, you know. And Prithvinarayan Shah, the king who set us off on this modern journey, called Nepal the yam between two boulders, right? And he said, you know, it's India, China, and US being the predominant power of the 20th century. But we lived through the Cold Wars, and one experience that Nepal has in the 20th century is we managed all these diverse world powers quite well and leveraged all that in the interest of Nepal's development. So the Chinese, the Indians, the Americans, the Soviets helped a lot during the 30-year period of the Panchayat. But all this sort of makes us quite timid in the exercise of soft power for a country which is quite popular. These people are quite admired, and a lot of soft power is there. Yet we've not been able to leverage that fully. There are many smaller countries that punch above their weight, and I think with a more confident leadership in Nepal, we should be doing this. Just to capture the earlier story, I mean, this is the historical data series from Angus Madison's data set. Nepal's data starts somewhere around 1816, the Anglo-Nepal War. These are obviously informed estimates, but if you look at this historical perspective, on the y-axis is the Gary Khamis international dollars, and this is just GDP per capita, right? Nepal is the black line. So if you take this historical view on a relative scale, Nepal has really not grown, right? Obviously there's some improvement because the scales are adjusted, but it's really a story of complete and utter stagnation, whereas all these other countries that we talk about have had critical junctures after which they've really made that leap, right? So it could be, for the United States, it could be after the Civil War, right, 1865 here. For Japan, it was the Meiji Restoration. So the red line for Japan, 1868, would be where you begin this upward climb, and then they collapse in the Second World War, and then but pick up again. Korea in the 1960s, right? China in 1978 with Gaige Kaifang. India in the 1980s with the reforms. So you have this story where, on a relative scale, Nepal basically just hasn't made that breakthrough. Now let's come to the current times, and this is where I think a lot of discussion, if you read Nepali newspapers, I think these three things is what I would say are a policy priority right now. Politics has really become rotten, and this inept, corrupt political class. But the point for people like us, especially talking at a university setting like this, is to ask why. How did this, why are we in the state that we are in, and what can we do about it, right? So it's not just enough lamenting about the situation. And for me, this Leaders for Life thing has an African parallel, right? So you look at the African continent. There are about 17 countries where rulers have ruled for more than 30 years. So the most infamous ones we know, Mugabe in Zimbabwe, Mobutu Sese Seko, and there are these guys whose names I can't even pronounce because they are from Francophone Africa, Benin and Gabon and Equatorial Guinea. These guys have ruled for 42 years. But if you look at how that started, many of these were heroes, independence heroes that fought against the French, that fought against the British. And they were, when they secured independence in the 70s, they were national heroes. And it was only natural that they ended up, controlling the reins of their state. But then in the course of assuming power, somebody said power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is when they then, after the first or the second term, they begin to entrench their positions. And this is where, you build a cronyistic state. You need money to sustain yourself. You need to sustain a large patronage network. And this is where corruption comes in, and it becomes an endogenous source of your sustenance, etc. Right? So in Nepal too, it's not as bad as Africa. But I was thinking about this the other day. A lot of the leaders that we talk about and condemn now actually really fought for democracy. So the current prime minister, he spent 10 years in prison. The younger generation who were born after, in recent decades, who don't know that history or have to be taught, right? There's other guys, relatively clean politicians who have spent 14 years. If it was a bigger country like Indonesia or South Africa, they would be celebrated like Nelson Mandela, Yet, Nepal being a small country, not really on the radar of many global discourses, these things are, but these guys have also become bad rulers now, right? And this is pretty much the same sort of process, the channel that you can compare with other low-income countries. And to break free of that temptation, to entrench yourself, become bad rulers, become corrupt, become almost, and harbor these sort of dictatorial tendencies, you need in line. And it's not that we don't have that, right? In India, one can say Nehru came out of as an independence hero, ruled for, 47 to 64, set many modern institutions that have done wonderful justice to India now. Even in a country like China, Deng Xiaoping, people came out of the revolution, set things up, put China in a whole reform path, and then left, right? Mandela, came out of the prison, did a single term, and retired. So it's not that everybody falls in this trap, but you need that degree of enlightened sort of leadership to be able to pull that off. Now, the problem with our class now is that old struggle stories have now been basically uncashed. They've been in position for so long. They've enriched themselves. They've built these large patronage networks. And the danger now to our modern democracy is, they've made the election so costly that genuine candidates, good candidates, are deterred from competing because it's just so expensive, because the role of big money is becoming very high. Typical, it's a country with $1,000 per capita, Nepal, on average. I am told a simple election cannot be run these days without $100,000, 1 crore rupiah, that's what we say in Nepal, minimum, for a parliamentary seat or even a simple mayor's seat. So you just do the maths. For on average, $1,000 per capita per year, one simple public office will cost at least $100,000. How do you get that money? It has to be corruption. So this has led to capture of a lot of state institutions, and they want to shield themselves from being prosecuted, right? And this is where the whole positions are being sold to the highest bidder. This is where all the checks and balances that you need in a democracy, an independent judiciary, an and very effective, very powerful anti-corruption body. Who are these politicians placing in those positions? All party loyalists. So this whole separation of power, rule of law, exercise of fundamental basic liberties. The fundamental distinctions between a liberal and an illiberal democracy that Farid Zakaria popularized in the 1990s, for example, is on classical display in a country like Nepal right now. We go through the ritualistic motions. We hold these elections every 3 years, every 5 years. We do elect these guys. Many of these can say, you know, hey, I'm an elected. People elected me. Yet that link that you need, that complementary set of institutions that you need for a functional liberal democracy, you know, separation of powers, rule of law, the exercise of basic liberties, just completely being weakened. And as I speak now, the judiciary is paralyzed, as many of you know. 20 justices of the Supreme Court are rebelling against the Chief Justice. Why? Because the Chief Justice was asking for some positions with the executive. There should have been a firewall, you know, complete dissociation between the executive and the judiciary. Yet, so this kind of bargains are happening, and you know, there are even more dangerous arguments about grand larceny and corruption associated with this. So this state capture, Akhtiyar and Nirbachan Ayog, you know, the election commission, these are all filled by party loyalists, and they would never go against the people who have appointed them. So these fundamental linkages that keeps a democracy alive and vibrant is being really going away. And the other important positions, ambassadors and general managers of public entities, state-owned enterprises, national utilities, are all being given to the highest bidder, not on the basis of merit and all that. And the root of that is that, you know, the elections are becoming very costly. The system is making, because once you are in politics, these guys don't have other skills to market. What struck me was I went to England as an undergraduate, and I used to see some politicians who would fight for something, lose, and then go into the private sector. Right? David Miliband, this very well-known, promising foreign minister of Britain, is running an NGO in Manhattan, where I live. And the former deputy prime minister under David Cameron, this guy from the Lib Dem party, I just saw is a vice president at Facebook. These guys have, you know, you can see it both ways, you know, this unholy nexus, blah, 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 but you can also say that these guys have marketable skills that these other, you know, you can come to the private sector. In a country like Nepal, there is nothing else to do. The opportunity costs are very low of being engaged in politics. So this has led to, because of state capture, etc., a lot of impunity, and there is very little pressure to deliver, because things that get you elected are not delivery and performance on the ground. It's how much money you accumulate, how much money, what kind of a patronage network you have, what kind of a hold you have on the police administration. And a lot of the people, I gather some of you are Nepalis here, have left the country. Those of you who could be out on the streets. So this epic migration, out-migration from Nepal, including the temporary migrants to the Gulf, etc., that has taken away that pressure for the politicians to deliver. Because, and this is a point I will return to later, that in a country of 30 million, in the last elections, only about 10 million people voted, right? 5 million are abroad, actual voters, even if you exclude people under the age of 18. So this kind of disenfranchisement, and almost it raises the question of whether the rulers are actually illegitimate. The second point is the private sector also, because politics dictates so many national affairs. The private sector, even the good guys can no longer survive, because there's unholy alliance, because these are the ones that fund the political class. For what? They collude, they have their syndicates and cartels, so they stop new entrants, young people who want to do a startup. I personally dealt with a case of a young entrepreneur who had gone to Harvard and seen this artisanal brewery at Harvard Yard, Harvard Brew House or something. So he said, why don't I do this in Nepal? There's so much tourists are coming and they would enjoy fresh beer, not bottled beer. The bottled beer industry completely scuttled that thing, you know. So this is a very small example, but it's illustrative of the larger malaise, which is that there's barrier to new entrants, there's collusion, and they have captured the regulatory apparatus. They lobby and bribe to extract fiscal concessions in terms of subsidies, in terms of tariff exemptions, tax breaks, etc. And that this is what is leading to a stagnant private sector. So it's almost like the license Raj. You know, if you have access to the politicians, you do well. you reap all these rents. But somebody who believes in an even competitive playing field, want to compete, deliver goods to the consumers and make money that way, that avenue is really being stopped. Now the bureaucracy isn't helping because it's very conservative. As I said, it comes from a very narrow, because of historical sort of reasons, comes from a very narrow base. It's very risk averse. And there too, politicization has really perverted the core incentives. They are underpaid, but they're also incompetent. And there's this whole mismatch between attributes and functions that we expect in a British-styled civil service. So this is the political problem, the private sector problem, and the bureaucratic problem. I think these three have been intertwined so deeply that we are now in a situation of what I've called the accountability trap, right? And this is something that I've yet to formalize, but I'm working with Abhidit Acharya at Stanford, a political scientist at Stanford, to try and see if we can give this an analytical flavor. We haven't formalized it yet, but I guess, and if you want to capture it in a single graph, this is the story, right? What I just told you. So we're in this low accountability trap. Voters. So this is the reward to bad candidates is high when the voter participation is not enlightened. We're not demanding. We're not exacting accountability. And this is perpetuating itself. And the idea behind traps is that this has to be self-fulfilling, right? So as long as you are in this territory where good candidates are deterred from entering the fray, and the bad guys are running the show, and voters are not very enlightened, educated, or engaged, this is the trap you are in. And we should be ideally going to the higher equilibrium, the more better trap, or an improved zone, reform zone, where reward to good candidates goes up as voter engagement increases. The bad guys are thrown out, throwing the bumps out is a popular phrase in Western democracies, and rewarding the good guys, re-electing them and all that. And this sort of is where we need to be. But how do we go from a lower equilibrium to a higher equilibrium? And this is the challenge, right? This is the challenge that we face in Nepal. How do we get this done? These guys control all the levers of power, and they are never gonna voluntarily relinquish all the privilege and the power that they enjoy right now. And this is the challenge, right? This is where young people, educated people who have seen the world need to go back and organize. And I was talking with Vishnu earlier. I think there are two clear channels. One, crises always gives that opening. So either the regime has to go into such a horrible shape, a major economic crisis that will give an opening for a new change, or it has to be young and charismatic people to jump in and organize in a new way so that you really fight your way through, even in the current flawed setup. And once you reach that critical mass, then you can effect change. And this has happened in the past. B.P. Koirala in 1960, he was 37 years old when he became home minister, coming immediately after the Ranas, etc. So that kind of a charismatic leadership, a group of young leaders can do that breakthrough. The other one is we need a crisis, some kind of an economic stalemate, some kind of and we've seen this, by the way. The 2015 earthquake was a huge crisis, and that allowed us to force consensus, however flawed, on the constitution that was taking almost a decade to formalize. How much time are we?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll expedite myself. The second one is also something of an S-curve. So reward to, so this is the economic returns to the economy, economic reforms, pro-growth reforms, dividends to the economy. And this is sort of the rewards to good candidates, good politicians who initiate those. And this is the first generation reforms. This is sort of the second generation reforms. In the first generation reforms, the way it works is, these are low-hanging fruits. So returns can be very high, even with very minimal reforms, stroke of the pen kind of reforms. So the reward can increase at an increasing rate, right? And then after this, in the second generation phase, where there are more painful reforms to be undertaken, especially institutional reforms. You may need to shut down firms, you may need to shut down companies, you may need to shut down government offices, you may need to lay off people. These are painful institutional choices that politicians often have to make, unpopular decisions. So the return there is increases, but at a decreasing rate, right? So these things are yet to be formalized, but I thought together with Abhidit, we sort of thought the story of traps is really what can explain the Nepali malaise right now. And the trick going forward is to really find ways creatively to go from a low equilibrium trap to a high equilibrium trap, right? Now, forward-looking agenda. So as I mentioned earlier, the answer to a flawed democracy is a more refined democracy. So we need to be, aspiring for a politically liberal society, but all these perverse incentives that politicians have built for themselves need to be attacked. There's a lot of discretion in what they do. So one good thing of the recent constitution for me has been that if you enshrine, the old mantra used to be, our guys know what they're doing. These are, people who came out of revolutions, spent 10, 15 years in prison, they have the country's interest at heart, etc. No, that's no longer the case. So you need to tie their hands, right? If you say, okay, you cannot appoint more than 25 members in your cabinet, because there were times when they appointed 50, 55 ministers in a cabinet, in a classic display of this extravagant patronage, right? Now, Constitution has said no more than 25, so they cannot violate that, right? So one answer to that is really that once you constrain, even with the whole dissolution of the House of Representatives in recent months, the Supreme Court has come back and reinterpreted the Constitution and said, hang on, because of this period of instability, you guys enshrine in the Constitution that you can't easily dismiss the House of Representatives as long as viable alternatives can be made, right? So constraining these perverse incentives, I think, is the way to go in the future. And again, shielding, curbing their discretionary authority over appointments, restoring that sanctity of separation of powers, limiting role of money, for example, by going for public financing of political parties. So there's a whole, dozens of points that one can embark on to clean up this mess if we only have slightly better leaders who get this, right? We need to widen the franchise, as I mentioned earlier. People need to be, and the Supreme Court has ruled on this. The migrants need to be given the voting rights also. And as I mentioned earlier, leverage crises and charisma to jump from a low trap to a high trap. Socially, I explained in length about the whole historical roots of our exclusionary outcomes. And this is where I think social protection regimes, quality education, quality health regimes, publicly funded or forced through a creative partnership with the private sector, can do a lot in restoring some of that intergenerational mobility. Are you more educated than your parents were? Are you in an occupation or a profession different from that of your parents? These are some of the markers and indicators of intergenerational mobility. In Nepal, we're making progress, but there's extreme diversity by ethnic group. On average, we're headed in the right direction. But again, the Brahmins and the Kshatris and the Newars tend to do much better than, let's say, the Dalits or some particular groups in the Tarai, in the plains, right? And finally, the economic agenda is really the second generation reforms. We mimicked the Indians in the early 90s. And what Manmohan Singh did as a finance minister in 1990, we were also pressured to undertake many of those reforms. And many of those reforms in the 90s actually sustained us through very dark periods during the civil conflict, instability, etc. But we've never done second generation economic reforms, the more painful reforms, the deeper reforms. And this is where I think a fresh elected government, coming from a new election, is something they should be doing. But to execute a lot of that, taking the help of that conservative, risk-averse bureaucracy before we reform it, you need a capable regulatory state. And here I love this formulation of Danny Roderick, who says, because markets are not self-creating, markets are not self-regulating, markets are not self-sustaining, and markets are not self-legitimizing, you do need a state to intervene, especially if you are aspiring for a developmental state at such a low level of development, trying to get your footing and traction, right? So finally, yet in this journey that we have over the next few decades, assuming that we make some breakaway, that people's frustrations do give way to some kind of a creative outlet, we do get some good candidates, good politicians, good political parties, more attuned to the aspirations of modern voters. I'm a born optimist. I like this American line here in which they repeat, the candidates, that the best days of America are ahead of us. So I'd like to believe that even for Nepal, our best days are ahead of us. But this is conditional on us being much more enlightened that now. There are risks on the path. The disasters are a serious issue. As someone who lived and managed affairs of the state during the earthquake 2015, this is real. You know, 1 56-second earthquake can wipe off development gains accrued over 30 years. Climate change now is very serious. Just yesterday, you guys probably saw this damning visual from an avalanche in Mustang. Yeah? Glasgow had just concluded. The guy who presided over the Glasgow climate talks, Alok Sharma, he mentioned Mustang and Nepal as in his opening speech, because we are exhibit A of climate change because of the altitude. And so if the rest of the world succeeds in capping average global temperatures at 2 degrees or even 1.5, there's something called elevation dependent warming, which adds another 0.6 degrees centigrades. So, and those Himalayan glaciers, those Himalayas that we share with China, India, Pakistan, Bhutan, sustain 10 river systems, and directly and indirectly the livelihoods of about 2 billion people. So threat to that, you know. And it's not just global greenhouse gas emissions, it's locally generated black carbon as well, which we can tackle. Human capital depletion, you know, a lot of talented people that should be powering this growth process are abroad. If the growth momentum is secured, of course many people return. This we know from Korea, Vietnam, India. A lot of people go back to a country, you know, even at half the salaries if there is exciting opportunities. But we need to get that growth process going to attract back many of the people who have left the country. There is something called the neighborhood effect. It's a euphemism to basically acknowledge the role of India in many of our affairs. It's a big power, rising power. There are, if we can get this relationship right, it can be leveraged for our advantage in terms of infrastructure investments, etc., tourism, middle class, FDI, trade, exports, etc. But there are also adverse effects, you know, from pollution to transboundary conflicts, to infrastructural coordination, and even constraining of monetary policies. Remember that Nepali rupee is constrained to the is tied to the Indian rupee, and we've sort of, you know, these what IMF economists call the Lilliput syndrome. You know, when you have a very powerful neighbor to your with whom you share a contiguous border, and you're a small country, naturally many things are constrained. But ultimately, poor governance is what I think is a big risk, and as we are experimenting with federalism, that remains a challenge. If we don't get our acts together, and there is this bouts of instability, reversal of regime changes, etc., political regression, and the private sector doesn't have any incentive to invest, my fear is, you know, by 2050, when we become go from an aging society to aged society. So remember, I mentioned that Nepal is a young country. Median age is only 24, but this window is shutting fast. It's 2028. Our projections show that we'll become an aging society in 2028 or 2030, and we'll become an aged society in 2054. So we really have 20 to 30 years to get our acts together. If we don't, then from a country of $1,000 per capita, in current terms, will probably be $3,000 per capita, which is not even the Sri Lankan level of standards of today, 30 years later, right? So we will be an old society without ever having been rich. The second problem is because of this migration, internal migration, and people who go back, they are not going back to the rugged mountains, their villages. So we'll be an urban society. It's already 63% of our population lives in so-called municipalities, but without having effectively modernized or even industrialized, right? And we are globally connected. Cell phone penetration is 125%. Even the illiterate tea shop owner is looking at Facebook and Twitter and Instagram in the remote villages. But we are peripheral. We are just absorbers from the sidelines. We're not actively engaged in this global economy, right? So let me end with this thought that the story is really about traps, breaking free of these traps and going from a low equilibrium to a high equilibrium, going into this dynamic, self-fulfilling sort of reform zones. And I do see demography as one big hope, conditional on it being organized. And again, that issue of charisma, that political organization, just sometimes, you know, historical accidents, serendipity plays a big role in the fortunes of nations. One hopes we will be at that point, but I am quite optimistic. I didn't just put that as an aspirational wish list. the Nepali Congress General Convention is coming, and one hopes that there's a whole crop of young, very young leaders who are highly likely to assume some very important positions, right? So these things are not happening in a vacuum. There's a whole process that will lead to that outcome. So organize for an aspirational society, this whole generational shift is one big hope. Democracy, there's no better way to govern such a diverse, such a heterogeneous society. There is something in the literature, I'm not a political scientist, but I've read some cases by Francis Stewart on Sri Lanka, Kenya, Uganda, where they sort of document these stories of how some have managed to avoid conflict. And I think Professor Varshini's research also touches on some of these issues. But autocracy is probably easier to sustain if you have a homogeneous society. If you have an autocrat from a minority in a diverse country, then your base is already narrow. Then that leads to the kind of state that Saddam Hussein was in, for example, right? When you're relying on a very, very narrow base of support. For a diverse country, there's no better way to aggregate our diverse preferences than through a functional democracy. Not the kind of flawed, imperfect democracy that we have now, but a more refined democracy. But there can't be running away from this. It has to be made much more inclusive and functional. And finally, the distance. Again, I return to that theme of our proximity to China, our proximity to India, proximity to Southeast Asia. If you fly from Kathmandu, within 4 hours of flying distance, you can probably cater to half the world now. And that whole Daniquois analysis of our shifting economic gravity being somewhere in the Himalayas. I joked that maybe that's the new Mount Everest tip, symbolically, is that point, that hypothetical point of the center of economy. So density, these population centers that we can serve for tourism, for FDI, for our exports, for concessional finance from China and from India and other emerging powers is something to be leveraged. Diaspora will increasingly become our asset. And post-COVID, I think we are looking at new sources of economic growth, right? Suddenly digitalization and green energy, our immense resource in hydropower, everything being powered by clean energy, not just for Nepal's consumption, but also to displace dirty sources of fuel in India, to help that and be a good regional global citizen by exporting clean energy. Tourism will grow in prominence. And fortunately, a lot of these areas are where Nepal has an innate advantage. And I used to make this point that in the 19th and the 20th century, the prevailing models penalized a landlocked country like Nepal. We were just further away from world markets, right? Everything that we could do, India would be able to do it 30% better. Vietnam would be able to do 20% better. China, because of access to seaports. But that model of shipping-dependent trade serving the world markets is gone now. So you can live on the mountaintops of Nepal and serve the world with the new sources of growth that we can. But all that will not happen in a vacuum. You will eventually need enlightened political leadership to carry us through. And one hopes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waglé. I am certainly enlightened. I have a few questions, but I have opportunity to meet with you later, so I'm not going to use my advantage here. So I'll open the floor to questions and comments. Professor Varshini.
Nepal was a very favorite destination for Kathmandu, was a very favorite destination for young couples for their honeymoons, for example. There was a time when Lebanon played a role, when it was called the France for the third world country.
Yeah.
That was an earlier time, and hadn't come of age. But when I came of age, and people older than me, couples older than me, people older than me thought of places to go to, Kathmandu was really it was very popular. And we also know that from a tourism perspective, it was very popular. So can you just say something about tourism over GDP? How much remittance comes from tourism and GDP? Has it been going down, going up, staying stagnant? And there's a theoretical reason for it. A number of small countries that are very pretty, that have mountains or are surrounded by seas. Small countries, typically tourism is a very important source of economic growth for them. Costa Rica, Sri Lanka tourism was huge in Sri Lanka, right? Malaysia, I know, is huge. And, Bali is just enormous.
Yeah.
You know, Indonesia per se it may not be huge,
Right.
but Bali, you know, is a huge, tourism is a huge part of the overall economy. So if you can say something about it, that will be very useful. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Varshney. I think let me answer these three because I've thought about all three of these issues in some length. On landlockedness, you know, there are 40 countries in the world which have landlocked countries in the world which have a population of more than 250,000. So ignore, you know, Liechtensteins and Andorras and others. So with 250,000 or more, there are 44 countries. There are some very rich landlocked countries. Switzerland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria, right? But there's one, remember, so it's not the fact of being landlocked per se, the geographical attribute that is. The question is, where are you located? If you are a landlocked country in the middle of Europe, the traditional disadvantages associated with landlockedness, which is the costly distance to world markets, is gone. On top of that, the 6 or 7 rich European countries that are landlocked yet rich also have something that we don't talk about often. They actually are not landlocked. They have access to a navigable river. Switzerland, the classic, the most famous landlocked country in the world, 50% of the Swiss population actually lives in low-level cantons with access to the Rhine. So you go to a city like Basel, it's a manufacturing powerhouse. All the pharmaceuticals are being loaded onto these giant ships that nonetheless float on the Rhine, and they can come straight to New York. So that exception. So other than those exceptionally rich yet landlocked countries, which is a story of navigability, so they're not technically landlocked, that costly distance to ports and then onwards to world markets doesn't apply to them. There's a second tier countries which are sort of middle income, but are doing reasonably well, from Botswana to Belarus to Kazakhstan. How do they stand out? They're all rich in oil or minerals. So Botswana, which was actually the first least developed country to graduate out of that status, it has very well managed diamond mines. 2 million people, very well managed mines. If you don't manage it, it leads to conflict. So Sierra Leone, El Salvador, you know, all these other African countries, it's diamond triggered conflicts. Botswana, just again, quality of institutions, enlightened leadership at the time of independence, and Swarnim Wagle has a nice chapter on this, on how Botswana pulled it off. But good, non-extractive, inclusive political and economic institutions, and their most important asset, diamond mines, was well managed, and they've managed to lift them up. Kazakhstan, very rich in natural resources. So if you're not in the middle of Europe with no access to navigable rivers, or you are not rich in mineral resources or oil, the remaining, if you do a list, they're actually at the bottom of the league. So even Laos and Mongolia, landlocked countries in Asia, Laos is very rich in hydro resources now and exporting a lot of electricity to Thailand. They have a lot of timber and wood resources, etc. Mongolia is rich in copper and gold and all that, right? So it's these resource poor countries like Nepal and Afghanistan, and about 20 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are really, really condemned by this geographical fate. So that's the landlockedness story. On top of that, and this is where I think the political angle comes in, Professor Varshney, that because your resource base is so tight and limited, this is where the perverse incentives of political rulers. So whatever is creating, whatever little wealth there, creating rents, you tend to expropriate that. So the things that you need in a landlocked country to negate the traditional disadvantages, what do you need? You need a world-class airline service, like Ethiopia is trying to pull off, actually. Ethiopia is a very good example. I went and studied there. They have the largest airline industry after South Africa. Yes. Right? And their ambition is to beat Turkish. You know, they're very confident that they will beat South Africa, which is like 10 times their per capita income, and they're chasing the ambitions of Turkish, you know, for a landlocked country. And that vibrant, that successful airline industry has actually led to a birth of an entire leather industry, footwear industry, cut flower industry, new sources of job creation, etc. So that's a separate story. But the point I'm making is some of the landlocked countries then expropriate these limited sources of earnings by, let's say, monopolizing the utilities, right? So telecom, airlines, are the ones that negate the association. So if you have a very efficient airline industry, the shipping dependent trade can be negated a little bit. In the era of digitalization, we need the world-class internet and fast broadband access, world-class telecom services. There's no reason why we can't have it in Nepal, right? It's a, it's an issue of technology, buying that technology and just applying it. In 1991, when Nepal opened up, Indians across the border used to cross the border to come into Nepali towns, border towns, to make a call. Our system was just superior. But we, because of this reform inertia, we just lost these 20 years of whatever head start. But the point I wanted to make there, how the limited resource rents and these political extractions are intertwined, is it leads to not landlocked, then leads to policy locked mentality. So we've done this, Aditya Matu has done this analysis at the World Bank, 2013 paper, looked at landlocked countries and how liberal their services industries are. And it turns out the most regressive and closed airline and logistics and telecom industries happen to be in landlocked countries. It's a very interesting question, right? And these are the precise industries that you should be more liberal and efficient in, because these are the channels through which you negate the other disadvantages, the other handicaps of distance, of costly access. Ethnic diversity, let me make that, so in terms of numbers, it's 126 ethnic groups and caste groups, but it's 18 that have a share of higher than 1% population. So it's, even 18 is actually quite a lot, right? And so for Nepal, I think this has been a problem, right? So this was one of my 3 historical ills. We just have to accept that we've been an exclusionary state. I don't believe in today's generation being punished for the choices that previous generations made. We existed, we survived as a nation state, and the rulers back then did make very painful choices. Otherwise, we would probably be, part of another country right now, right? So there were painful sovereign choices that were being made. But together with that came many of these painful experiences as well. And this is where affirmative action and the substantive equality that we are now talking about is very much welcome. And as I mentioned at the outset, I don't think the Maoist rebellion was necessary. We could have done many of these things in a non-violent way. But one positive outlet of that was that people finally started to acknowledge that this is an exclusionary state, and this idea of inclusion and representing everybody in this diverse country is the only way forward. Otherwise, we will again relapse into conflicts and rebellions and regressions and etc. And if we can do that, people are very tolerant. The mountain people, plains people, we've coexisted in relative harmony and peace for 250 years or thousands of years if you go back to the prehistoric times. So that has to be leveraged. And this richness, this cultural richness, can be leveraged for our exercise of soft power. So could be through tourism, could be through others. So I see it as an asset, but we have to manage it. But again, the affirmative action that we put in place now is completely captured. So we have reserved for, say, in the civil service and even in the parliament, seats 33% for women. But who are coming under the women quotas? The wives and mistresses of politicians. Who are coming under the marginalized Madhesi, the plains people? The richest man in New York, richest man in Nepal, who is ranked to be a billionaire by Forbes, the only billionaire of Nepal, is an MP under the Madhesi quota of Nepal, right? So these are some perversions. So we have to stop that. And Reagan used to talk about the Cadillac queens who went for welfare to collect welfare payments in this country in the 80s. A lot of that has a racial connotation, etc. But there was some truth that's, to how these things can distort incentives. So this question of state capture, corruption, the inept and that political behavior has to be corrected. And this is where, but affirmative action that is meaningful, that is really aimed at lifting the people and the groups that were historically marginalized, has to be with us for the next generation or so. That's my thing. And finally on tourism, that's so our national accounts, if you look at the national accounts, so GDP is 35 billion. Tourism brings in about 2.5% of that, direct earnings only. But for a country as beautiful as Nepal, it should be, in my own estimate, it should be at least 10%. Yeah? And why am I saying that? I have a benchmark for that. Cambodia which came out of a harrowing war and is only trying to regroup now, but has made very rapid progress. Its share of tourism in its GDP is 10%. Bangkok, Thailand, much more established, longer history there, 13%. The tiny islands, Caribbean, 40-50%, but we're not really that. But you're right, and but there were two reasons why the Indians came during the Panchayat era. This is the 80s and the 90s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. One was Bollywood. So Devanand was filming a lot of his movies in Kathmandu, Hare Ram, Hare Krishna, and all that. Amitabh Bachchan was in Mustang filming Khuda Gawha and all that. So all of that cultural icon, cultural thing plays a role, but more important, shopping. Shopping was an issue as well, in the sense that you are a very closed society. India was a very, it's a license Raj until 1990. So a lot of the luxury goods, jeans and t-shirts and the fancy watches and perfumes, it was all taxed crazily in India. Nepal had done the tariff arbitrage, no tariffs. So Indians who had the money, middle class Indians, would come, do sightseeing, way less polluted, very beautiful city, and also do a lot of shopping. And all that went away after India liberalized. So that source of earnings just disappeared. And this is why we say, we need to be relying on more durable sources of growth. We're just tariff arbitraging for decades and neglecting the more fundamental resource. Okay, let me take other.
I'll go with. Sorry, you can go.
I'm Priyanka. It's
Hi,
nice
Priyanka.
to meet you.
And then
I had a couple of questions, and firstly, I really enjoyed your presentation. The first question is the kind of points you were making about indigenous people and this ethnic diversity. So when it comes to development projects, especially big infrastructure development projects, how has Nepal addressed concerns that come with like local conflicts over there and what the path forward looks like? And my second question is around the issue of climate change, something that you talked about as well, and the way adaptation and mitigation look like for Nepal, which groups have been centered in these discussion processes, and how effective the path forward looks like.
Let me take two more and then.
Yeah, Ramaji.
Sure. Namaste. Thank you so much. This was very enlightening and great to see you again. I don't know if you remember, we had met back in 2016 when we did the post-earthquake symposium.
In Dartmouth, yeah?
Yeah. So great to see you again. My question is, you touched upon this a little bit, but really around the sort of the demographics of the country and how we really have 30, 40 years to cash on the demographic dividend that we're sort of offered, and we've 20, 30 years have passed, I think, already, and by 2021, our population average age would be like high 60s, 70s, and it's really scary to think about what has been done to really cash on that. So my question really is, after the sort of new constitution and the new federal system, a little bit more decentralized, have you seen any policy in place to cash on that? And if not, how do you see maybe provincials and local government kind of working autonomously to making some of these, migrant workers who might have returned after the COVID-19 pandemic, or the young population to stay? So I would just like insights on that.
I think one more.
Thank you for the talk. I really appreciate the historical rootedness of how you see our predicaments and social ills are. So, and I use the word rootedness purposefully because uprooting is a difficult task too, and it's a radical task. So I wanted to ask you a little more specificity on these two things that you have talked about as a way to go forward, either a crisis or a charisma. And I ask this because from your talk too, and from living, I guess, Nepal is a land of both crisis and charisma. There's crisis every day. And there are big crises happening, So what kind of crisis and charismatically are you talking about? And I mean, the two crises that we kind of touched on here, and now that's, if we call it a crisis, and the earthquake. I mean, I think, you know, you say now this may not have been necessary, and the earthquake may have been necessary for the passing of the Constitution. But like, you know, there are lots of, I mean, the passing of the Constitution came with a lot of political problems. And first Maoist, the outcomes of the Maoists, or the movement itself is, is something to be talked about. So yeah, just something on.
Yeah, thank you. So on infrastructure projects and the concerns of indigenous groups, etc. I mean, there's in many of these things, because Nepal relies a lot on external borrowing and external assistance when it comes to big infrastructure. Our revenue is just enough to support the army, the bureaucracy, the teachers, and the health workers. Anything extra, we need to borrow. So there's a flip side to that, which is that many of these external sources of funding come with conditions, right? So the World Bank, which in 60s and the 70s was obsessed with infrastructure and didn't care too much about social safeguards, environmental safeguards, learned the hard way, through, especially in the 90s, you know, as the world opened up and there's a lot of civic movements, from the Oxfams to the Greenpeace, and you know. So when Jim Wolfensohn became the president of the World Bank in 1995, the first decision he took, president of the World Bank in Washington, D.C., first decision he took was to cancel a major hydroelectric project in Nepal, 1995, Arun, which at the time was huge, and had that come into the pipeline, we wouldn't have possibly gone through these crippling power cuts that we ended up experiencing decades later, right? But why did he cancel it? Because the concerns over the social safeguards and environmental safeguards were very high, right? This was about destroying flora and fauna in the Makalu basin, affecting the livelihoods of many indigenous peoples, involuntary relocation, settlement, etc. Right? So we've come to accept and internalize many of these guidelines, especially in internationally funded projects. In projects that we fund ourselves, we may be more lax, right? Yet there too, there is a fear of international disciplining and monitoring, etc. So we've become very, very good at these things, and these are fortunately being internalized and mainstreamed. In fact, to the point, and I was talking with Professor Varshney earlier, that sometimes these conditions of environmental and social safeguards can be so onerous that governments are now saying, we don't need your money if you're imposing all these constraints. We're going to go to other sources which are not imposing these very stringent criteria, right? So there's a flip side to that as well. But I think more or less, you know, issues of compensating for land acquisition compensation is actually the most expensive component in many large projects now. So we're doing a better job on all this, right? Climate change, as I mentioned, Nepal will be the exhibit A of the adverse impacts of climate change with the melting glaciers. And look at what that will do to our hydroelectricity production, agriculture production, disasters, frequency of disasters, drinking water, everything, you know, that is related to water. And 10 river systems, not just on the Indian side, but on the Chinese side. The Yellow River and the Yangtze River, they flow from the Tibetan Plateau, right? So this is massive. This is going to be massive. And ICIMOD, this international organization based in Kathmandu, has been doing some fantastic work on this issue. So Nepal should be a champion on this issue. And our Prime Minister did go to Glasgow, and we pledged to be carbon neutral by 2045. But a lot of Nepal's own contributions are going to be negligible, right? It's the black carbon that's coming from the Indo-Gangetic plains, the pollution that's happening in China that's going to melt our glaciers. It's not 3,000 electric vehicles flying in Kathmandu that will solve the climate crisis. Yet, I think to get that moral head start, ethical head start, to be a global champion on this agenda, we need to be doing many things right, and we are well positioned for that. We can power everything in Nepal through clean, renewable hydroelectricity resources, which is not the case in other countries, right? On demography, yeah, so median age is 24. Our 2021 census, which has now been going, will probably reveal a new number. But based on morbidity, mortality, fertility, all these things, our projections, the last time I checked, was 2028, 2030, we will be an aging society, which is 7% of our population will be above the age of 65. That's the formal demographic definition of aging society, which is huge, by the way. Under 18, you can't work. Under 65 is 7%. So the base, which is supporting the elderly, is constricting. Aged, we will become in 2054, right? So which is 14% of the population will be above the age of 65. So we really have another 10 years and then another 20 years. Otherwise, we will be an old society without ever having been rich, not even middle income rich, like Sri Lankan levels, as I like to say, right? So it's a big challenge. And this youth bulge started in the mid-90s. And we've kind of lost 2 decades. So remittance, the birth of the remittance economy has done many good things, but also it has impacted a lot of economic and social costs. But a lot of these young people have been exported. So Nepal's main export now is manpower, sending young men and to a small degree women to the Gulf. So look at the remarkable rise of the Gulf, Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Kuwait. It's Nepali workers alongside Filipino and Bangladeshi and Kerala and these other workers that we know. Qatar native population is 250,000, yet their total population is 2 million. The rest of the population is all migrant thing, and a lot of Nepalis there, almost 500,000, just in Qatar alone, the small. So if we had an economy that was going, we had a more enlightened political class concerned about development, at least half of them possibly could have been absorbed in our own country, right? But nonetheless, this remittance story it has sustained us until now. Many of these people will come back as aspirational citizens who will probably demand change, demand reforms. So there are positive sides to it as well. But the state has not been doing too much. I mean, there are tokenistic programs. Skilled migrant returnees will give you 1 lakh rupiah. That's $100,000 for goat farming and chicken rearing. That's not exactly this basic survival style subsistence programs. So we've not been creative enough in leveraging this resource, and this is going to be very important for another 10 years at least, our dependence on remittance. Even if we halve the current ratio from 24 to 12, we're still at Filipino levels. Remember, when you talk about a remittance-dependent economy, people say, oh, Philippines. Philippines is only 20 to 13%, 12 to 13%. So even if we pull off a miracle and halve this dependence, we'll still be at Filipino or El Salvador levels, which is still high, right? So there's a lot to be done to absorb this thing. Federalism, we need the local level empowered entities, the 753 local municipalities, rural and urban. We need a strong, capable regulatory state. There are questions being raised about the middle layer, the provincial tier, whether for a small country like Nepal that is really needed. And all that has done is created about 1,000 plum posts. Again, this distribution of patronage. You have the Mukhyamantris and the Ayogs and the Pradesh Samsads and all these people who the politicians can just distribute the largest. And that increasingly, they could have played a coordination role, right? But in Nepal, that's not the role that they're playing. Now, to give them the benefit of the doubt, we're still in early years. This is just the 3rd, 4th year of federalism. So I personally think we'll go through 2 cycles and then see if this regime needs to be amended, right? On the ills, on the crisis and charisma, I don't believe in one guy charismatic leader coming and fixing the country. Not at all. If that was the message, I need to correct myself. I really don't believe that. But charismatic leadership, the Chinese say, I think the fish rots from the head. So if you have a charismatic, clean, competent leader, we even used to say you can be corrupt, but at least deliver, for other countries. But in Nepal's case, it's corrupt and inept, right? So that could have been a bargain that we would have been able to settle for. But with the charismatic leadership, I think the whole group that surrounds that charismatic leadership, and I gave you the example of BP Koirala, who I see, at that time, he didn't act alone. He had this amazing crop of allies around him, from Subarna Samser to Ganesh Man to Ramnarayan Mishra to Surya Prasad Upadhyay. There was a whole generation that Krishna Prasad Bhattrai, that carried the whole movement. Unfortunately, they only lasted 17 months because the society was way backward, the monarchy infringed. So, but charismatic leadership in a country like Nepal is necessary to organize, to inspire, to rally these diverse groups around a common purpose, and that is very important. And charisma can come from, I'm not just talking about the conventional firebrand orators who can really inspire if they are authentic. Madan Bhandari has showed some promise, but Gagan Thapa in our generation is one possible leader, and he was the one I was hinting at. He will most likely be the General Secretary of the Nepali Congress Party in a month. That will be a huge shift for a country like Nepal, where politicians are not giving room to younger people, right? There's all these barriers to entry and all that. So it's this just saying enough is enough, and we better get into politics. So some good guys then creating a momentum for others to come into the fray, so that low equilibrium to high equilibrium. Remember, it's a self-fulfilling thing, right? So now we have low expectations of the corrupt politicians. The voter engagement is less, and that's why you are in that trap. Once you break that, cross that tipping point, the reward to good politicians will be higher. So that was the whole idea of that very simple model conceptually, right? The other is crisis. Crisis gives us that opening. Panchayat fell because there was a movement and people were fed up with the 30 years of misrule, autocratic misrule. But the big trigger was the embargo. The economy was badly hit, and that sort of intertwined with the popular unrest led to the collapse of the regime. The Ranas were easily dislodged because their main source of support, the British, had left India, right? And these enlightened folks who were educated in Banaras under British institutions, they said, hang on, India is moving on from a British colony to an independent state. We have a puppet regime in Nepal that was supported by the British, so we can now get rid of them. And very easily, with 1,000 militia, Mukti Sena, Rana regime collapsed, right? With the support of the king, of course, and the legitimacy came. The earthquake was an example in the sense that the 8 years of stalemate around the constitution drafting was the earthquake gave that opening for people to come together. And there were a lot of grievances, and it's still an imperfect document, but I still think it's better to have something on the table that you can refine and amend over time than not have anything at all, right? And it was ratified by 90% of the population, yet the Madhesi people had a lot of reservations. 90% of the parliament, but the Madhesi people had a lot of reservations. And since then, we've had an election, national election, series of local elections, and many of the Madhesi parties are now coalition partners. They're in government, etc. So the crisis that I'm talking about is now, the economically, and we're possibly heading that way. COVID could have been that, but we were not hit as hard as people guessed. But some kind of a macroeconomic crisis, might give that opening. When people come to the streets and demand change, and regimes collapse under burdens of indebtedness, under foreign invasions. This is if you look at 2,000 years of world history, this is how that crisis can give an opening. Even in the U.S., we hear sometimes never waste a good crisis, right? So it's charismatic, enlightened leadership that says enough is enough, and we have to jump into the fray, shake things, and that has happened in Nepali history. The other one is crisis, again paving the way, making that process slightly easier. Otherwise, from a political science perspective, what are the incentives for these corrupt guys who are extracting from the regime now to voluntarily give up the position of power and privilege that they currently enjoy? There has to be some kind of external thrust there, I think. And that will come. And a lot of forces are moving, right? Demographic force is there. The technological push is there. The international institutions are possibly less influential than they were in the 90s, but that is also there for a country still dependent on international solidarity and support.
Yeah, I think with that we come to the end of the talks. Thank you so much, Dr. Wagle.